You know that feeling. It's a completely common experience, right? You just walked out of some, vibrant conversation. Maybe it was one of those classic American BBQs, just full of noise and people talking over each other. Or maybe you just finished a really gripping true crime podcast on your commute.
Yeah.
Or perhaps you wrapped up that detailed video conference call with your project team. Maybe they're based in Chicago or somewhere. For 20 minutes, maybe longer, you were absolutely immersed. You were following along, nodding at the right moments. You felt like you tracked the main arguments. But now, maybe an hour later, you try to put your finger on the specifics. You need to recall the exact sequence of next steps for that project, maybe. Or the crucial piece of evidence the true crime podcaster relied on. Or even just the specific punchline of the joke that made everyone laugh back at that BBQ. You pause, you search your mind, and it just draws a blank. It's gone. It's like the sound was perfectly clear when it went into your ear, but the words themselves just seem to evaporate instantly, leaving behind this, vague, really frustrating mist of comprehension. Now, for any listener, that's annoying, sure. But for you, someone navigating complex spoken English as a non-native speaker, that kind of fleeting memory, it can actually be a major barrier to progress. And it's absolutely vital to stress this. This isn't some failure of intelligence. It's really not. And it's likely not even a failure of your vocabulary knowledge. You probably know the words. This is fundamentally a technical challenge. It's about memory management and real-time listening.
And that's the core of it, isn't it? The dilemma. When we talk about fluent listening, especially at the speed, American English is often delivered. Memory just can't afford to be a passive storage locker you check later on. It has to be this active, agile architect, constantly building, connecting, retaining an intricate blueprint of meaning, while new sounds are still flooding in. And for a language learner, that whole architectural feat, it's performed under this immense, almost overwhelming cognitive load. The entire mental system just gets strained. It overheats almost immediately.
That concept, cognitive load, that seems really key here. It sort of implies that you're doing maybe twice the amount of mental work just to retain half the information a native speaker might get almost effortlessly. So, okay, let's unpack this a bit more. You mentioned working memory often being the biggest bottleneck. Can we dig into why this whole architectural feat is so critical specifically for learners?
We absolutely can, and we really need to. Because, to solve this problem, you first have to understand the mechanism behind it. This deep dive into memory, it's actually the foundation for so many of the listening skills we talk about. If you think about things like chunk listening, or using strategic repetition, or even just basic listening, for examples, every single one of those entirely relies on your ability to hold information, process it, and retain it while simultaneously taking in new information. If that memory part fails, the whole skill just collapses.
Right. So our mission today, then, is to sort of pull back the curtain on that invisible blueprint. We are going to dissect the 3 essential types of memory involved in listening. We'll try to illuminate the unique cognitive challenges that can overload a learner's brain, and probably most importantly, provide some concrete, actionable, and specific strategies, complete with US-based examples, to help you train your memory, to really make it your most powerful ally in moving from just basic comprehension to genuine, lasting retention.
Okay, so to start, we need to move past this idea that listening is passive. It's just not. It's actually a highly active, synchronized dance. It employs multiple memory systems all working together simultaneously. You can almost visualize it as a kind of full-on workshop operating inside your mind.
Okay, a workshop, I like that. Let's start with the first system then, the fastest one. Sensory memory. It sounds like something that's barely even there.
It truly is barely there. This is the immediate, ultra-short-term holding tank. Just for raw sensory information, we're talking fractions of a second here, really, really fast. For our purposes for listening, this specific type is called echoic memory. Think of it maybe like an instantaneous audio buffer or a flash drive, like you said. It holds an auditory trace of sounds after they've hit your ear, but before your brain has fully analyzed them or, assigned them any linguistic meaning.
So it's literally the immediate, fleeting echo of the sound itself, even before it becomes a word in your head.
Precisely. Exactly. And its role, though fleeting, is absolutely foundational. It provides your brain with that tiny microsecond delay it needs, the time to process the individual phonemes, those raw sounds, and try to assemble them into recognizable syllables or words. Now, the challenge for the learner here is incredibly acute. It's pure speed. If your sound-to-word conversion process is delayed, maybe because you're unfamiliar with a particular blended sound pattern, like whatcha, or a specific phonetic shift common in certain U.S. accents, that echoic trace just vanishes. It disappears before full processing can occur. The sound is literally gone from the sensory stage before your brain could properly grab it and analyze it.
Wow. That sounds like a nightmare scenario, actually.
Yeah.
Because you didn't even miss the meaning or the grammar at that point. You missed the raw sound itself. If the echo's gone, you can't even rewind in your head to figure out what was said. You might not even realize something was said.
That's exactly why people often say things like, I know they said something, but it just sounded like noise, or it was just a blur. It's a failure right at the sensory input stage.
Yeah.
Which inevitably, immediately leads to a functional failure in the next stage, working memory.
Okay, working memory. Here's where you said it gets really interesting, because this is the system we always hear described as the biggest bottleneck, not just in listening, but on all kinds of language processing. And I'm really curious why that specific failure point is so critical, especially for a learner.
Right. Working memory is, it's your brain's active workspace. It's that mental workbench we mentioned earlier. Information isn't just stored here, it's temporarily held and actively manipulated, processed. But, and this is key, it has two severe inherent limitations. First, extremely limited capacity. Research generally suggests you can hold maybe about 5 to 9 distinct pieces or chunks of information at any one time. Not words, but chunks. And second, limited duration. That information naturally degrades. It drops out in about 15 to 30 seconds, unless you actively maintain it somehow through rehearsal or focus.
15 to 30 seconds doesn't sound like very long at all, especially in a fast conversation. So why is it so essential for listening then? What's it doing?
Well, it's doing pretty much all the heavy lifting in real time. You use working memory to link the subject at the beginning of a long, complex American sentence to the verb phrase way at the end. You use it to connect one sentence to the next, integrating them into a larger, coherent idea or paragraph. And crucially, you use it to figure out ambiguous meanings based on the context you just heard a few seconds ago. But for the language learner, this mental workbench isn't just busy. It's constantly flooded. It's overflowing.
Okay, let's talk about that specific flooding mechanism then. The sheer increased cognitive load. For a native speaker, listening feels largely automatic, like decoding meaning directly. But for a learner, what exactly is taxing the system so much harder? What's filling up that workbench?
You're basically running multiple resource-intensive operations all at the same time. A native speaker's processing is largely automatic, very fluid. But you, as the learner, you're often simultaneously trying to decode vocabulary that might not be instantly familiar. You're parsing complex, maybe inverted grammar structures. You're trying to adjust to the speaker's particular speed and rhythm, their accent. And you're trying to filter for cultural nuances or implied meanings that aren't explicitly stated. Every single one of those steps, for pretty much every single sentence, it drains that limited working memory capacity exponentially faster than it does for a native speaker.
Yeah, I think of it like trying to run 5 really complex, high-resolution applications like video editing, 3D rendering, gaming all at once on a computer that has a tiny, totally insufficient amount of RAM. Everything just slows to a crawl or crashes.
That is an excellent analogy, a really good one. And it leads directly to the next problem: slower processing speed. Because your brain is so busy juggling all those complex operations, the actual speed at which you process the incoming information is inherently slower. So the information you heard maybe 15 seconds ago, the first part of the speaker's point, it might literally expire or just drop out of your working memory before you can integrate it properly with the new piece of information that just arrived. That's the classic feeling, isn't it? Reaching the end of a long explanation and having absolutely no idea how it started.
Yeah, definitely. And this ties back to something you mentioned earlier, that sort of mechanical way learners often have to approach language, especially at first. Word-by-word processing.
Exactly. And this is just devastating to working memory. Absolutely devastating. Think about it. If a native speaker hears a common phrase like, "We need to schedule a follow-up meeting by the end of the week," they probably process that as maybe 3 or 4 meaningful chunks. We need to schedule a follow-up meeting by the end of the week, something like that. But if a learner is forced to process every single word individually, we need to schedule a follow-up meeting by the end of the week, that limited 5 to 9 item capacity, it's overloaded instantly. The workbench is completely full before the speaker has even finished the instruction. There's no room left.
Okay, so we have the fleeting sensory data, the echoic memory, then the very busy, limited workbench of working memory. Finally, we have the huge reservoir, right? Long-term memory. How does that vast archive fit into this stressful reality of listening in real time?
Right. Long-term memory. That's your permanent storage system. Theoretically, it has unlimited capacity. It holds your entire vocabulary store, all your grammar rules, concepts, life experiences, everything. Its most crucial role in listening, though, is to provide the context. And the knowledge base, it's basically the scaffolding that all the new auditory information is processed against. It's what gives incoming sound meaning. This archive, your long-term memory, is what enables instant word recognition. That's called semantic memory. It allows you to anticipate where a sentence might be going based on typical patterns. And it instantly activates relevant schemas, which are these mental frameworks of background knowledge about topics, situations, culture, everything that allows you to interpret information much more quickly and efficiently.
And the obvious challenge for the learner then is that this English-specific archive, this pantry, is still under construction maybe. If your lexical knowledge, your vocabulary, or your grasp of grammar is limited, retrieving the meaning of a key verb or figuring out a complex sentence structure is just slow.
Precisely. And that slow retrieval creates that immediate processing stall we talked about back in working memory. It causes a bottleneck. But as you know, it's not just about language knowledge. Even if your vocabulary is actually quite excellent, the lack of cultural schema can be a massive hurdle, a huge one. If you don't have the shared cultural experiences or background knowledge that native speakers often take for granted, say, about typical U.S. corporate culture, or common American holidays like Thanksgiving, or even just popular TV shows or movie references, then references, jokes, or key implications become almost impossible to grasp. Even if you technically know the definition of every single word being used, you just can't retrieve the required context, that specific schema, from your long-term memory fast enough to keep up.
That makes perfect sense. It's like knowing the ingredients but not the recipe or why they're being combined. Okay, let's try to synthesize this whole process using that analogy you introduced. If the learner is a chef in a busy American diner, what does that whole integrated system look like when it's really under pressure?
Yeah, the analogy really lays bare the whole orchestration, doesn't it? Okay, so sensory memory, the echoic part, that's like the momentary smell of sizzling bacon hitting the air. It's the input. It has to be immediately acknowledged, grabbed, or it's just gone. Poof. Working memory, that's the chef's small, very limited cutting board. Right there in front of them, they're actively chopping vegetables, maybe tracking 2 different meal orders simultaneously. It's active, it's limited in space, and it's highly time sensitive. Things fall off if you don't manage it. And long-term memory, that's the entire pantry back in the kitchen, filled with every ingredient, every recipe they've ever learned. It allows them to instantly know that regular coffee in this diner means cream and sugar, or what a side of home fries actually entails without thinking. Now, picture the English learner stepping into that same demanding role. They're trying to work, but effectively with a smaller cutting board. That's the more limited effective working memory capacity due to the extra processing load. Their pantry, the long-term memory that's missing ingredients, those are the vocabulary and grammar gaps. And the recipe book they are working from, the structure of the conversation, the cultural norms, it's one they were still actively trying to read and internalize. All while the orders, the stream of auditory information just keep flooding in really quickly. It is quite literally a recipe for cognitive overload and ultimately memory failure. Things get dropped, orders get missed. Cool. So if we connect this back to the bigger picture, really understanding these specific memory failure points, it helps us truly appreciate why listening often feels so much more difficult than reading for a learner. Reading is static, right? You control the pace. It allows you basically unlimited time for retrieval and processing. But listening, it's dynamic, it's sequential, and it's completely unforgiving of delays. And the factors we're about to discuss, they actively conspire to drain that precious limited working memory even faster.
Okay, let's dive into those factors. First up, the one we feel most immediately, the sheer speed of delivery and the nature of connected speech in American English.
Yeah, this is often the first assault on both sensory and working memory. American English, particularly in informal settings, is characterized by its generally high rate of speed, and crucially, its massive use of connected speech phenomena. We blend words together, like gonna for going to. We drop sounds, which is called elision, like probably for probably. And we change sounds where words meet, that's assimilation, like handbag for handbag. Mm-hmm. Our source highlighted that great example, how what you gonna do is actually the contracted blended form of what are you gonna do?
Right. And the cognitive task there for the listener is just incredible, isn't it? Your brain has to perform this rapid, nonstop phone segmentation. It has to take that continuous stream of sound, somehow break it apart into discrete, recognizable words, and then assign meaning to them. That constant effort is a huge tax on working memory resources.
It absolutely is. And that tax leads directly to an immediate stall, especially when you combine speed and blending with specific cultural jargon. We have the perfect USA example you mentioned earlier, the bustling, Maybe slightly chaotic New York City deli or bagel shop. Just picture yourself, the learner, standing near the counter. It's noisy. People are shouting. The deli worker yells the order back to the kitchen. Can I get a bagel everything with a schmear and a large regular coffee?
Right.
Like one long word. That single phrase is this intense combination of speed, sound blending, and very specific local jargon. Bagel everything is practically one blended unit. Schmear is common NYC Jewish deli jargon for cream cheese. And, critically, regular coffee in many East Coast places, especially NYC, often specifically means coffee with milk and sugar added by default. Now, if you're trying to process that sound stream word by word, maybe trying to separate bagel everything into bagel and everything, or if your brain pauses even for a split second trying to define schmear or wondering why they didn't ask how you want your coffee, your working memory is just instantly overwhelmed. It essentially shuts down before you can even fully understand that they're just talking about a common breakfast transaction. You're lost.
Yeah, total chaos for the brain's processing center. And then compounding that speed issue is the second major factor, vocabulary and grammar gaps. You called this the mental stall. It feels like if I stall on just one unfamiliar word, I'm almost guaranteed to miss the next 2 or 3 sentences entirely.
Absolutely. That's exactly what happens. When you encounter unfamiliar terms, or maybe a particularly complex grammatical structure you haven't fully internalized yet, your working memory, which remember is already overworked just keeping up with the speed and sounds, is forced to expend critical, limited resources on retrieval. It has to try and define that unknown word from context or parse the complex grammar structure to figure out subject-verb relationships. This radically slows down your overall processing speed and creates this significant backlog of unprocessed auditory information that just keeps piling up from the speaker, who hasn't stopped talking.
The university lecture example you gave earlier really illustrates this cascading failure perfectly.
Right. Imagine you're sitting in an American history class. You're trying hard to follow, synthesize complex ideas, and the professor says something like, "The manifest destiny ideology fueled westward expansion, leading to significant demographic shifts." Okay, if manifest destiny, or perhaps the verb fueled in this context, are terms you haven't recently encountered or can't retrieve instantly from your long-term memory, that entire sentence basically stalls in your working memory while your brain frantically tries to resolve the meaning of those key terms. The professor, however, doesn't wait for you. They immediately move on, maybe delivering the next 3 sentences about the gold rush, the displacement of Native American populations, and the subsequent economic consequences. All that crucial subsequent information is completely lost to you, gone, because your memory system got stuck. It stalled out, trying to define just 1 or 2 critical words from the start of that paragraph.
And it's not just about speed and vocabulary complexity, is it? We also have to deal with the sheer variety in how English sounds across the U.S. accent and intonation variations. That requires a genuine mental adjustment in real time.
It really does, and that adjustment consumes precious working memory resources. The U.S. has remarkable regional accent diversity. You've got various Southern accents, the distinctive Boston accent, Midwestern nuances, Californian patterns. The list goes on. If you're primarily trained or accustomed to, say, General American English, often heard in national news broadcasts, shifting your processing to understand a strong, non-rhotic Boston accent, for example, requires this additional layer of cognitive translation on the fly.
Okay, so for the listener, what exactly is the mechanism of that cognitive translation? Let's use the Boston accent example from the source material to make it concrete. How does that drain memory?
Okay, so in General American, which is rhotic speech, we typically pronounce the R sound after a vowel. Think of words like car or park or hard. You hear the R. In a classic non-rhotic Boston accent, that R sound after a vowel is often dropped, or sometimes replaced with a slight vowel sound. So car might sound more like ka, and park might sound like pak. Yard becomes yad. Now, imagine you are listening to a Boston sports commentator who gets excited and says something like, he had to park the car in Harvard Yard. Your brain's just listening for the meaning, he had to park the car in Harvard Yard. It's actually running this simultaneous phonetic translation process in the background. Your working memory is busy equating pakiag with the standard park, resolving that ka means car and yad means yard, maybe even recognizing had as Harvard. By the time that phonetic resolution is complete and you understand the sentence, the processing of the meaning has been significantly delayed. And you've likely missed the next crucial point the commentator made about, say, the team's defensive strategy or the player's stats. It's an enforced dual processing that just eats up capacity.
Wow, yeah. That makes it really clear how the physical sounds themselves, not just the words, can block comprehension and overload memory. And that brings us back to long-term memory's major weakness for learners, the lack of schema or background knowledge. You called it the missing scaffolding.
Yes, and it's often the most humbling challenge, I think, because it's less about language skill per se. Speakers, especially within their own culture, constantly assume a base of shared knowledge, shared experiences, shared context. And if you lack that context, that specific schema or scaffolding stored in your long-term memory, you can miss the entire point of what's being said, even if the language used is relatively simple and you know all the words.
The casual Super Bowl conversation is just the perfect illustration of how deep that cultural knowledge gap can be in everyday American life, right?
Absolutely. It's a prime example. You might encounter a casual chat at the office water cooler or overhear something in a cafe about the Super Bowl. It's a huge cultural event. They will invariably use technical football terms like touchdowns, field goals, maybe complain about the quarterback's performance, but they'll also likely reference cultural touchstones related to it, like the famous halftime show performer, or specific commercials that aired years ago, or the significance of winning for a particular city. Now, even if you look up quarterback and understand it's a position in American football, if you haven't activated the basic schema for American football, if you don't know the fundamental goal of the game or the relative importance of a touchdown versus a field goal, you might understand the words individually. But the overall meaning, the context, the enthusiasm or disappointment being expressed, the implications of the conversation, was that a good play? Is this team doing well? Are completely lost. Because your brain simply cannot retrieve the necessary background knowledge, the football schema, from long-term memory quickly enough to make sense of the discussion.
Right. You're just hearing words without the framework to understand their significance. Okay, finally, we hit the factor that seems almost mundane, yet you said it can be the most destructive, distractions and multitasking. It sounds simple, like common sense, but why is it such a critical drain on listening memory specifically?
It is, quite simply, the easiest and most common way we sabotage our own working memory. Working memory is incredibly fragile. It's highly susceptible to interruption and diversion of focus. We often ask it to do far too much, especially in today's world. Trying to listen intently to complex spoken English, say, in a meeting or lecture, while simultaneously checking emails, glancing at social media notifications on your phone, or even just thinking intensely about what you need to buy at the grocery store later. It severely reduces the cognitive capacity actually available for the primary tasks of language processing. The conference example is classic, isn't it? Trying to follow a detailed technical presentation while simultaneously trying to discreetly scroll through emails on your laptop. It ensures poor retention of the key presentation points, and you probably don't absorb the emails properly either. The focus is split, the memory workload is divided, and both tasks inevitably suffer.
Okay, so we've outlined the memory systems and all the ways they get overloaded. This really raises the most important question for our listener. How do we stop trying to just push harder, which seems like it only increases our cognitive strain and frustration, and actually start training smarter? We need specific strategic training methods, right? Designed to optimize each of those memory stages we talked about.
Exactly. That's the key. We need to actively build that mental scaffolding and manage the workload. And interestingly, the work starts before the listening even begins. The first set of strategies falls under pre-listening, activating your long-term archive. Essentially, you're proactively preparing your brain, priming it to receive and store the information more effectively.
And the strategy seems wonderfully simple on the surface. Just engage your existing knowledge about the topic beforehand, like read the title of the talk, look at any key images or visuals provided, read a short summary or abstract if available, or even just take 30 seconds to brainstorm keywords you expect to hear.
Exactly. It sounds simple, but the memory benefit of this kind of preparation is enormous. It really is. By consciously pre-activating relevant schemas, those existing mental frameworks related to the topic in your long-term memory before you listen. You essentially provide immediate hooks or connection points for your working memory to latch onto when the new information starts coming in. New information doesn't arrive into a cognitive vacuum. It arrives with some pre-built context. This makes it much easier for working memory to integrate and retain it, significantly reducing the overall strain.
Let's look at that example of Maria preparing for her U.S. college scholarship interview. This isn't just standard interview prep, it's actually targeted memory optimization, isn't it?
Absolutely. Maria is getting ready for this important interview, and she knows the stated topic is leadership in a diverse environment. That's a complex, culturally loaded topic in the U.S. She knows this. So she doesn't just jump on the call cold. She spends maybe 15, 20 minutes beforehand just jotting down some key vocabulary related to leadership and diversity. She reflects on her own past leadership experiences, maybe making quick notes. And she thinks about how concepts like diversity and inclusion are typically understood and discussed in an American academic context. This pre-activation retrieves all those relevant experiences, concepts, and vocabulary from her long-term archive, moving them to the forefront of her mind. This strategically frees up her working memory during the actual high-pressure interview. She can then focus 100% of her cognitive resources on understanding the interviewer's specific, perhaps nuanced phrasing and formulating a detailed, coherent, relevant response, rather than scrambling mid-sentence under pressure, trying to define diversity in the American context, or recall a basic leadership example she actually already knows but hadn't pre-activated.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. That little bit of front-loading effort really pays huge dividends when you're under pressure. Okay, now let's move into the really challenging phase, during listening. How do we keep that fragile working memory workbench from collapsing under the relentless flow of incoming sound and information?
Right, this is where we need active management techniques to handle the capacity limits. The first, and arguably one of the most essential strategies during listening, is chunking. We mentioned it before, but it's about grouping for efficiency.
We've talked about the theory, recognizing and grouping words into single, meaningful units, like at the end of the day, or it goes without saying, or on the other hand. But how do we practice doing this actively during a rapid conversation or lecture? It sounds hard to do in real time.
It takes practice, definitely. But you train yourself to listen for the meaning of the entire phrase, the whole chunk, rather than focusing on the individual words within it. And the memory benefit is radical because these prepackaged familiar chunks act as single units of meaning in your working memory. This massively reduces the number of distinct items your working memory has to hold and track at any given moment. Think about it. If a phrase like, "we need to get this done by the end of the day," is processed as maybe 1 or 2 meaningful chunks, instead of 9 or 10 individual words, you've potentially freed up almost 80–90% of your limited working memory capacity to process the next idea the speaker presents.
The business meeting story with John, the listener, perfectly illustrates that kind of instantaneous processing that effective chunking provides.
Yeah, John's in this fast-paced project update meeting. There are multiple action items being discussed quickly. When his American colleague says something fairly common like, "Okay, on that point, we need to circle back on that later," John's trained ear instantly recognizes "circle back on that" as one single predefined chunk. He knows it just means revisit that topic later. He processes the intent of that chunk instantly and almost effortlessly without analyzing the individual words "circle back on that." This prevents a processing stall. It frees up his working memory to immediately focus on the next point being discussed. Maybe it's the critical project timeline, without missing a beat because he got stuck on the previous sentence.
Okay, chunking helps reduce the load. What's next for active maintenance? You mentioned micro-summarizing and paraphrasing. This sounds like active rehearsal.
Yeah, it is exactly that. It's the active rehearsal component needed to stabilize information in working memory. The strategy is either mentally in your head, or perhaps by quickly jotting down a keyword or two if appropriate, to create a very brief summary or paraphrase of what was just said. You might do this every few sentences, or perhaps every time the speaker seems to shift to a slightly new point or topic. This active rehearsal forces you to process the meaning more deeply. It helps consolidate the idea, makes it more stable, and prevents it from degrading and falling out of that volatile working memory stage too quickly. Plus, it serves as a real-time comprehension check. If you can't summarize it, you probably didn't fully get it.
Right, like Emily on that fast-moving Boston Freedom Trail tour, forcing herself to take a moment to synthesize the information internally.
Exactly. The tour guide on the Freedom Trail is likely speaking quite rapidly, maybe rattling off historical names, dates, and events in quick succession. After a segment focused entirely on Paul Revere's Midnight Ride, Emily, instead of just letting the information wash over her passively, quickly forms a brief, internal, simplified thought. Okay, Revere rode at night, warned colonists, British were coming. Something super concise like that. That quick mental recap checks her understanding, reinforces the key details for retention, and ensures she doesn't immediately lose those specifics when the guide abruptly shifts focus to talk about, say, the architecture of the Old North Church or another historical figure. She's actively managing her memory load.
Another technique that I find really powerful personally is visualization, creating that mental image or scene as you listen.
Oh, it's highly effective. Because our brains are generally much better at remembering concrete images and sensory scenes than abstract words or data points. The strategy is simply to try and convert the abstract language you're hearing into a concrete, perhaps multisensory, mental picture. The memory benefit comes from creating a richer, more memorable, multimodal memory trace. It's often easier to recall the movie in your head later than just the string of words.
The Florida weather report example is great for this. It gives you a chance to basically make a little mental movie rather than just trying to retain a list of weather terms.
Precisely. Imagine hearing a somewhat complex forecast like, expect scattered thunderstorms developing this afternoon, bringing potentially heavy downpours, especially impacting coastal areas, which could lead to some localized flash flooding near the interstates later today. Okay, instead of trying to mentally juggle those 7 or 8 different keywords, scattered thunderstorms, heavy downpours, afternoon, coastal, flash flooding, interstates, you actively try to visualize it. Picture dark, heavy clouds gathering over a beach scene. See thick rain starting to fall. Maybe imagine water pooling quickly on the roads near a highway sign. See cars slowing down. This mental movie creates a more consolidated narrative memory trace. It helps you recall the key elements and the overall gist of the forecast much more effectively later on than just trying to recall that list of technical weather terms.
Okay, that makes sense. We also need to talk about the necessary skill of selective attention. This sounds like giving yourself permission not to understand every single word, which can feel counterintuitive for learners.
It can feel counterintuitive, but it's absolutely critical for managing cognitive load and preventing working memory from getting completely overwhelmed. The strategy is to consciously decide to prioritize. Listen actively for keywords, main ideas, speakers' arguments, key examples, or specific pieces of evidence cited. You are essentially consciously filtering out the surrounding noise, maybe highly technical jargon, redundant phrases, or less critical details, and focusing your limited processing power only on the most critical information. Trying to understand and retain every single word, especially in complex or rapid speech, is often the fastest route to understanding and retaining almost nothing at all.
This seems particularly vital in situations like that university panel discussion scenario, where there might be a lot of complex, perhaps unfamiliar academic jargon flying around.
Absolutely. Imagine that panel is discussing, say, renewable energy policy, and the experts start using very specific scientific or economic jargon terms like photovoltaic cell efficiency curves, grid parity calculations, or geothermal heat exchange coefficients. End quote. The savvy non-native listener, recognizing they can't possibly process all that technical detail in real time, makes a strategic decision. They choose to ignore those specific, overwhelming technical terms for now. Instead, they intentionally focus their attention only on extracting the main arguments being made for or against solar power, listening for the key comparative statistics presented, even if approximate, and maybe noting the names of the research organizations or key figures involved. By strategically letting the highly technical details wash over them, they ensure they actually grasp the central thesis and the main points of the discussion, which is usually the primary objective of listening in such a context.
Right, get the big picture first. And then for maybe longer, more structured listening tasks like lectures or webinars, we really need to leverage note-taking, basically externalizing that memory burden altogether.
Yes, using notes as an external memory aid. But the key here, especially for real-time listening, is efficiency. The strategy is not to try and write full sentences, which is impossible while listening actively. Instead, you jot down only essential keywords, very short phrases, maybe abbreviations or symbols that represent key concepts or connections. This note-taking functions as an external storage device, directly offloading some of the retention burden from your overtaxed working memory. And crucially, the act of deciding what to write down, even if it's brief, forces active processing. You have to evaluate, in real time, what information is important enough to warrant recording, which aids comprehension and initial encoding.
Like the example of rapidly taking bullet point style notes during that fast-paced digital marketing webinar.
It's exactly. You're listening to this rapid-fire presentation. You quickly jot down concise cues, maybe AI tools personalized content, or TikTok Gen Z focus, or perhaps measure ROI, need data focus. These are rapid, very short, meaningful cues. They help you track the flow of information and the main topics covered without demanding massive working memory expenditure for the act of writing itself. They provide essential memory triggers for later review and recall without blocking your ability to continue following the speaker's next complex point as they keep talking.
Okay, so we've used these strategies to manage the information fire hose during the listening process. We've kept the workbench from collapsing. Now comes arguably the most important step for long-term learning. The content has to actually move from that temporary workbench into the permanent archive, into long-term memory. How do we ensure that crucial post-listening consolidation happens effectively?
Right, this is the stage where memories actually become stable and sticky. And research shows the single most effective strategy here is immediate review and recall. It's all about active retrieval right after the listening ends.
So the strategy here is literally as soon as the audio stops or the conversation ends, spend just a few minutes actively trying to recall the main points, maybe key examples that stuck out, or even areas that felt challenging.
Yes, precisely. That active, effortful retrieval process is empirically one of the most powerful ways known to strengthen neural pathways and transfer information from that fleeting working memory state into the more durable long-term storage system. It forces your brain to reconstruct the information, not just passively recognize it. This effort strengthens the memory trace significantly. If you don't try to retrieve it fairly quickly after exposure, the chances of it being lost increase dramatically. The forgetting curve is steep.
Like the listener who finishes listening to, say, This American Life or another story-based podcast on their commute and uses the time while parking the car to actively review the narrative.
Exactly. Let's call her Sarah again. She finishes listening to a complex, maybe multi-act story on her drive home. She doesn't immediately switch to music or start checking her phone notifications. Instead, while she's parking or walking from the car, she takes maybe 60 seconds to mentally run through the narrative structure and key details. Okay, the first act was about that guy who found the lost wallet. Right. And then he returned it, and the owner invited him to that really strange, unexpected party. Then the second act shifted focus, detailing the host's unusual job history. That quick internal mental recap, performed immediately after the listening event, helped solidify the narrative structure, the sequence of events, and the key takeaways in her mind before they have a chance to completely fade.
Okay, immediate recall is powerful. Then we have repetition and layered listening, which sounds like a more strategic, long-term use of spaced practice.
It is. And the strategy here is key. It's not just listening again and again passively. It involves re-listening multiple times, but ideally with different specific listening goals for each pass. And importantly, spacing these listening sessions out over time, maybe a few hours, a day, or even a couple of days later. This concept of spaced repetition is highly effective for building robust long-term retention. Why? Because it forces your brain to retrieve the information after a period of natural forgetting has started to set in. This retrieval effort strengthens the underlying memory trace much more effectively than cramming multiple listens back to back, making the memory more durable and resistant to decay over the long run.
Using that political debate excerpt as an example really demonstrates this layered approach clearly.
Right. Let's say a learner downloads a challenging 5-minute audio excerpt from a high-speed, maybe contentious political debate. First listen. They might aim only for the gist. What was the main topic? What was the overall tone? Agreeable, argumentative. Then, maybe the next day, they listen a second time, this time focusing specifically on extracting the key policy details or any statistics mentioned by the speakers. Then, perhaps 2 days later, they listen a third time, now focusing only on how the arguments were made, listening for rhetorical devices, specific examples used as evidence, or patterns of interruption. This kind of multi-layered, spaced approach embeds not just the content, but also the vocabulary, the common phrasing, and the structural features of that type of discourse, much more deeply and permanently into long-term memory.
That makes sense. The third post-listening strategy, connect new to old, seems absolutely vital for creating meaningful, well-indexed storage in that long-term archive. It's not just storing facts, but connecting them.
Exactly. This process is often called elaboration in memory research, and it's essentially about giving new information context and meaning by linking it to what you already know. The strategy is to actively try to relate the new information you just heard to your existing knowledge base. This could be knowledge in English or even concepts from your native language or culture. Look for similarities, differences, potential implications, or connections to personal experiences. The benefit is that you create richer, more robust memory traces. Why? Because you're actively building connections between the new knowledge and your existing mental archive. This creates multiple, secure retrieval pathways, making the information easier to find and access later on.
Like the example of listening to an economic report on NPR and actively linking it to either global economic principles or a personal experience from one's home country.
Precisely. Maybe you hear an NPR report discussing rising U.S. inflation rates and ongoing supply chain issues affecting consumer prices. Instead of just passively absorbing those facts about the U.S. economy, you actively try to connect this information. You might think to yourself, okay, so rising gas prices and these logistical snags here are causing this massive ripple effect on food prices. That's actually quite similar to what happened when our national currency devalued last year back home, affecting import costs. This act of linking finding the similarity solidifies the underlying economic concept. It ensures the new information about the U.S. situation is instantly more memorable and retrievable because it's now indexed or filed under a broader known concept in your mind.
Fantastic. And finally, the strategy you called the ultimate retrieval test. Teach or explain to someone else.
Yes, this is often considered the gold standard for consolidating learning and identifying knowledge gaps. The strategy is simple. Try to explain what you heard and understood to someone else. This could be a friend, a language exchange partner, a tutor, or even just explaining it out loud to yourself, the rubber duck method. Why is this so powerful? Because teaching or explaining is the ultimate form of retrieval practice. It forces you to organize your thoughts coherently, articulate the subject matter clearly using your own words, and immediately identify any areas where your comprehension or memory is shaky or incomplete. This active process of retrieval, organization, and articulation strengthens the memory trace in perhaps the most durable way possible.
So if a listener finishes an audiobook for their English language book club and then actively explains the plot twists and character motivations to their language partner the next day, that forced organization really solidifies their retention, doesn't it?
Absolutely. That act of having to retrieve the details, sequence the plot points logically, analyze character motivations out loud, and maybe defend their interpretation, it forces them to move beyond passive consumption of the story. It compels them to actively organize and structure the information learned from listening, ensuring those details are stored in a much more accessible and durable format within their long-term memory archive. They truly know it then. So just to sort of summarize the main takeaway here, developing stronger listening memory, especially as a non-native speaker, it's really not about being born with some inherently good memory. That's mostly a myth. It is entirely about first acknowledging the unique cognitive burden that L2 listening places on your brain. And second, it's about employing effective, consistent, targeted strategies tailored precisely to how the brain actually processes dynamic language through those sensory, working, and long-term memory systems.
Right. And alongside those core strategies, we have a few final, very practical tips that can support all this work. They seem like common sense, but they're crucial. Tip 1, actively manage distractions.
Yes. Dedicated, single-pointed focus is absolutely paramount for protecting that fragile working memory. We can't emphasize this enough. Find a quiet environment when possible. Turn off phone notifications. Close unnecessary tabs on your computer. Make the act of listening the only primary task you're doing at that moment. Trying to multitask during high-level, demanding listening is practically a guarantee of memory failure and frustration.
Okay. Tip 2, control the speed when you can.
Yes, give yourself grace here. Don't hesitate to use playback controls on audio or video players. Slowing down the speed to 0.75x or even 0.5x, especially for initial listens or particularly challenging content, is a smart tactic. Remember, the primary goal for a learner is comprehension and memory retention, not simply enduring breakneck native speed just for the sake of it. Comprehension has to come first, always. Speed can be built up later.
Good point. Tip 3, prioritize meaning over individual words.
This relates back to selective attention and avoiding stalls. If you encounter an unknown word, try not to panic or get stuck on it. Don't let it derail your entire focus. Often the surrounding context or subsequent sentences might clarify the word's meaning later on. Or frankly, sometimes that specific word just isn't crucial to understanding the main point anyway. Getting stuck on one word is a surefire way to create that working memory bottleneck we discussed in Section 2, causing you to miss everything that follows. Keep the big picture in mind.
Tip 4, embrace imperfection. This is a big one for language learners.
Absolutely. You are simply never going to remember everything you hear. Native speakers don't remember everything they hear either. The focus should be on progress, not perfection. Aim to remember more information and more accurately over time. Celebrate those incremental improvements in your retention capability rather than getting frustrated by the inevitable things you miss.
Makes sense. Tip 5, listen actively with a clear purpose.
Yes, don't just hit play passively. Each listening session, whether it's a short 5-minute news clip or a 30-minute business meeting recording, should ideally have a clear, conscious goal beforehand. Okay, this time I'm just listening for the overall gist. Or, this time I'm trying to catch specific dates and names. Or, my goal now is to identify 5 common phrasal verbs or chunks. Or, I'm focusing on pinpointing the speaker's main pieces of evidence. This kind of intentionality makes your listening far more focused, active, and ultimately much more memorable.
And finally, tip 6, the underlying physical foundation. Maintain your physical well-being.
It might sound unrelated, but it's fundamentally important. Basic things like getting adequate sleep, maintaining good nutrition, and managing stress levels significantly impact your cognitive functions, especially working memory capacity. A brain that is tired, hungry, or chronically stressed simply struggles much more with the immense cognitive load required for processing a non-native language in real time. Taking care of your physical health directly supports your mental capacity for learning.
Okay, so we've really walked through the entire blueprint today, haven't we? From that fleeting echo of sound and sensory memory through the critical bottleneck of the working memory workbench, all the way to storage in the permanent long-term archive. It seems clear that listening mastery, especially in a language like English, is just deeply, fundamentally intertwined with developing a more robust, strategically trained memory system. It's all about consciously managing those complex cognitive processes, holding, connecting, and storing information effectively in real time against that relentless ticking clock of fast-spoken English.
Exactly. By understanding the specific function and also the potential failure points of your sensory, working, and long-term memory systems in the context of listening, and then by actively, consistently implementing targeted strategies like chunking, visualization, micro-summarizing, spaced repetition, and schema activation, you can genuinely move beyond that frustrating cycle of fleeting comprehension towards achieving deep, lasting understanding and retention.
And this blueprint, these tools, they allow you to navigate complex auditory environments with much more confidence and success. Whether that means finally understanding that rapid-fire New York Delhi conversation, or grasping the nuanced arguments of a challenging university lecture, or being able to accurately recall the crucial next steps agreed upon in a high-stakes virtual business meeting.
That's the goal. Memory becomes the engine. It ensures that the rich, often fast-moving tapestry of American English doesn't just wash over you as incomprehensible noise, but actually becomes a permanent, accessible, usable part of your knowledge base. So maybe the question for you, the listener, is, how will you consciously use just one of these strategies, perhaps visualization or micro-summarizing, in the very next piece of English content you consume, maybe even today, to start actively building your own permanent blueprint for listening success?